Hi you guys, welcome to our second lecture video. Today we're going to talk about scientific thinking. So, here are your learning goals again for this set of lectures. There's always going to be one whenever we see each other, or really just in its own topic, because sometimes I just like to break it down. And then this will also be found on your Canvas page. So make sure you take a look at it at the end to gauge how you feel about the topic and if you need to go back and review the information. So now we're going to start taking a look at how science is done. Right now, most of you guys are non-majors, so you may or may not do scientific thinking a lot, but whether or not you realize that you actually do it, even in the simplest of ways. And I'll talk about that once we get to the diagram. But whenever we are looking at the natural world, asking questions is really the most important part. All of the discoveries that we have made or we have done, right, as a human race, started with a question, really, right? It started with even something as simple as, how do I make this milk last longer, right? How can I make my fields of wheat, right, yield more, right? Anything that really is related to problem solving, you're using the scientific method and your scientific thinking in order to do that stuff. So, scientific method, again, maybe you might have learned this in high school. High school might have been a long time ago, but it is just our set of steps in order to answer that question that we have, right? So our explanation of the natural world does rely on something called empirical evidence. And there are three types, right? Rational, testable, and repeatable. So whenever we do scientific experiments or scientific research, we need to make sure that the data that we get is good, right? Because if we just accepted whatever data our experiments yielded, then again, we probably wouldn't be as advanced as we are as a civilization right now. So what does this mean? Rational. Rational means that explanations are logical and do not invoke any supernatural forces, right? And this is one of the things I love about science is we always have to back it up with something, right? And so an example would be this is just a really great example because science was just both weak and strong during the pandemic. So I'm going to use the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic as an example, right? Back then, when we were still trying to figure out what the heck is going on, right, there was a lot of whisperings, lots of, truth, some lies, right? Maybe lots of lies, some truth. But it was really important that we back up our information. So things, it could be something as crazy as, oh yeah, like this virus, it spread through blah, 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 right? And so the rational person, hopefully, will say, where did you get that information from, right? If a person says, oh, I heard it from my grandma, or I heard it from a relative, unless that relative or that grandma is a doctor, right, it probably does not bear any truth in what they said, right? It's kind of like rumors. Like there needs to be some evidence on your claim, otherwise it really shouldn't be accepted, right? But we accepted a lot of different things at the beginning of the pandemic to explain what the heck was going on, right? And it's just about now that we're starting to get a little bit more information and more accurate information about that incidence, right? But I guess I'm gonna get on my soapbox now. But if anything else, right, that I can teach you guys at the end of the semester, even if you forget everything that I taught you, I want you guys to get out of here with life skills like that, like being able to talk to someone and say, where did you get that information? Did you get it on Reddit or did you get it on the CDC website, right? Stuff like that. So that's rational. Testable, it needs to be tested. It can't really be opinion based, right? So something like, if I ask you what your favorite ice cream flavor is, right? Everybody's going to answer something different. And even if I said chocolate and you said chocolate, we like chocolate maybe for various reasons, right? It needs to be subjective. So a lot of the times when we're doing scientific data collection, it needs to be numerical because numbers don't lie, right? It's very straightforward. If you use even something as simple as color, right? Sometimes if I look at a color, I mean, right now I'm looking at a yellow shirt. To you, that might look maybe a little bit more orange, right? Some of you guys might be fancy and be like, oh no, that's a goldenrod shirt, right? Or no, that's a canary yellow shirt. Like, I don't know, right? Color itself is also very subjective. So needs to be able to be valid and be able to be tested in various ways. Repeatable, right? For something to be accepted in the scientific community, you need to have done it multiple times, ideally over multiple years, right? It's the same thing, going back to the COVID example. If I was a scientist working on a vaccine, for example, if I only did it once, let's say I did my vaccine trial once, and I'm like, okay, whatever, it didn't work. Oh well, moving on, right? Then we would never get anything done. Well, you just leave that project. It's kind of crazy, right? Or vice versa. Let's say it did work, right? But maybe it was a false positive. Maybe it was a fluke. Maybe it wasn't supposed to work and something just happened that you didn't realize that made this. And so then you tell your supervisor, hey, this vaccine works. And then you go ahead and send it out and it doesn't actually work. Like, I don't know. To me, that's just kind of ridiculous, right? So whenever scientists do their experiments, they need to do it multiple times. Um, Again, ideally over a long period of time, right? And like I said, in terms of the COVID stuff, we're still really studying it still, right? We have better information now than we did at the beginning, but still not with the long term effects of it. So, here are a couple more, and this is what I mean when I tell you guys sometimes I get ahead of myself because I already talked about this a little bit, right? So, whenever we collect evidence, we need to be able to focus on the facts and not on the opinions, right? Because everybody has a different opinion, and that could sway your experiment, that could sway your findings, right? So these are just things that you need to think about whenever you are collecting data. And again, that doesn't have to be in the scientific field, right? That could be something like buying a computer, right? Whenever I buy something off the internet, usually, especially on Amazon, I try to look for reviews, right? Because that would be my evidence, right? And a lot of the things on Amazon are opinion based. So it's a little harder that way, right? But we need to make sure that we look at the facts of any situation, right? Um, when rigorous process is not followed, poor inferences may result, right? So some results cannot be repeated, and examination of supporting evidence show inconsistency and error. So like I said, you never know. Your first run at it might just have been a lucky result, right? Sometimes there have been some situations or just scientists have done the same experiment over and over and over and over and over and over again and get the same result, and then they tweak like one thing, and then for some reason it happens, right? So that's again, the scientific field is kind of a frustrating place to be, especially if you are like me, and you guys will get to know me a little bit better. But this is not a one and done profession, right? It's trial and error. It's learning from your mistakes and tweaking it to make it better, right? So I don't know. We'll get to that just a little bit more. Um, but if you have poor inferences, right, the poor inferences can again mislead people, right? Again, going back to the pandemic, there was a lot of misinformation, right? Because we didn't really know, and that's not our fault necessarily. There wasn't a lot of information out there, right? Nowadays, I mean, obviously we're all back to pretty much normal, right? But now we have a better understanding of what happened during that time, right? But a lot of times, especially when something weird or something big is happening, um, people unfortunately prey on people's feelings and they kind of create this panic, right? Which I'm sure we all experienced during that time. But like I said, if nothing else, I want you guys to be able to look at a piece of information, right? And say, okay, is this factual or is this opinion based, right? If it is factual, where did you get this fact, right? You need to be able to look at all of that stuff. And believe it or not, you already do that every time you get on the internet, right? Every time you get on the internet, you do that. Okay, so then let's practice. And again, because this is another video lecture, I'm gonna trust that you're gonna try this activity and I'm gonna do my best to predict what you guys will say. So here's a picture of a bunch of kitties, right? So it wants you to do, it wants you to come up with questions that you would ask about these kittens. Could be anything, right? As many as you can. Maybe put yourself in like a minute timer, right? And then I want you to classify them, the questions that you made, right? Classify them as being scientific or not scientific, right? So I'm gonna pause. Let me go to the next slide because it'll give you a bigger cat picture. But pause it, maybe wait a minute or two, write down as many as you can, and then classify that as scientific or not scientific. Okay, so here are some questions that you may have asked, and I'm just anticipating that you guys, build something like this, right? But I already categorized it between scientific and non-scientific. So try, if you were struggling with that, try to look at these examples and see where yours might have landed, right? So scientific, again, it needs to be something that is testable, right? Something that we can create an experiment out of, right? Something that maybe gives us a numerical answer, right? So let's read a couple of these. It says the first one, why do kittens have different coat colors? Right? That is a genetics question. We can test that, right? Why do kittens have different eye colors? Right? Also a scientific question. I can test that. I can take a look at different cats, right? What causes their eye color to be that way, right? Which coat color is most, sorry, that should say most common, least common. Again, that gives us a numerical answer, right? It tells us, I gotta count all of the coat colors, right? And it'll give me a number. Last one, what factors affect how quickly kittens grow? That can be an experiment. I can change the type of food that they eat. I can change maybe the temperature of the room they stay in. Maybe I can change the amount of water I give them, right? So those are all scientific questions, right? Because I can get some kind of data, factual data out of it. And then I have these non-scientific ones, which you might have picked as well, right? Which kitten is the cutest? That is all opinion based, right? Because some of you guys, you might think that this black one is super duper cute, right? Some of you guys, you might like the orange coat on this cat, right? Some of you guys, you might like the eyes on this one. That's all opinion based, right? So yes, you can technically collect data out of this. This is what psychologists and sociologists do, right? You can get numerical data out of this, but it is opinion based, right? Next question, what color coat is the best? Same thing, right? Some of you guys might be partial to the black one. Some of you guys might be partial to the orange one or to the multicolored one, right? So opinion based. And then should I adopt a kitten? The answer is always yes. Yes, you should always adopt a kitten. There's a lot of kittens out there that needs a home. Dogs too. Dogs are cute, right? But again, opinion based. Okay, so here is our scientific method diagram. So I'm going to put a star here. Like I said, if I put a star there, means that this slide, the diagram, super duper important. So if you just go through the steps, right, a lot of times, and this is important, I'm going to say this again, this is important. A lot of times people think that the question is the first step of the scientific method, but actually, making an observation is the first step, right? So I'm going to give you an example, and this is going to be an example of something that you would do in everyday life, right? Let's say I go home from my bio. Hopefully you remember I have two cats, Felix and Luna, right? So I go home and I notice that there is a pee stain on the carpet. That is my observation. I see a pee stain on the carpet. Now, spoiler alert, I already know who did it because he does it all the time. But we're going to go through it as if it's the scientific method, right? So I made an observation, somebody peed. So then I asked a question, who peed on the carpet, right? So the next one would be I need to form a hypothesis. So I only have two cats. So my hypothesis would be Felix peed or Luna peed. Those are my hypotheses. So then I need to test that, right? Now, only a crazy person like me would probably carry out this actual experiment, right? But for the most part, you guys already know, right? If you have pets, they already have like tendencies or habits that they do. So for me personally, I already know Felix did it because he's usually the one that pees. Now, is that true all the time? I would say 90% of the time that's true, but that's just me. So if I was going to make a test or an experiment out of this, right? Ideally, what I would do, and again, this is gonna sound a little weird. Ideally, what I would do is I would have Felix and Luna pee again, right? So that I can compare the pee, right? If I had like special equipment or something and I can take a sample of the pee on the carpet and run it through a machine and it'll give me like, I don't know, like urine analysis or DNA analysis. Obviously, that's a little bit uh stronger of a data, right? But if I'm just doing everyday, comparison, that's probably what I would do, right? So then I analyze the results. So let's say they did pee, right? And then I go take the pee and I compare them to each other. Maybe the coloration is closer to one than the other, right? So then I will make a conclusion, right? Was my hypothesis supported or not supported, right? If it's not supported, then I could actually try again, right? Let's pretend I have a hamster. I used to have a hamster. His name was Gene. So let's pretend I have a hamster, right? If Felix and Luna, they peed, I collected it, and it didn't match the carpet stain, then I look at another possibility, right? Maybe it was Gene, right? Gene is a small hamster. So if the pee stain was very small, right, then it was probably the hamster and not the cats, right? But the main idea here is, again, you do this every day. Every time you make an observation, every time you ask a question, every time you try to solve something, that's the scientific method, right? Now, the misconception is that usually we write it as a line, but in all actuality, it's actually a little bit more complex than that. It looks more like this, right? It's a jumbled, beautiful mess, if you will, right? There's a lot of back and forth. It's not just like, oh, this is step one, step two, step three. You can see the arrows are pointing pretty much anywhere, right? So I can, I can do observation, ask a question, I do my research, maybe I do this, right? Maybe I do my experiment, but I can ask for feedback, right? Maybe, I don't know, maybe there's like a cat pro out there and be like, how can I figure out how my cat is peeing on the carpet, right? And then I can go back, oops, sorry, go back to the PowerPoint and go back over here and redesign it, right? Maybe I got more information and now I can give um, a more accurate steps in order to do that, right? I can get my data and realize, oh my gosh, I missed the step, so I can go back. So main idea is the scientific method. You can go back and forth, forward and backward, however you want to do it, right? Which I think really is one of the fun things about the scientific field. Okay, so here are just some definitions for you. I'm going to also put a star here so that you guys can take a look at your vocabulary, right? That you guys might have noticed I already mentioned the word hypothesis. So hypothesis is the proposed explanation for an observation. In high school, you might have heard it called an educated guess, right? That might have been something that was used, right? But we try to have you guys move away from saying educated guess because it's not a guess. Like there is something in your brain, in your instincts, whatever, that made you say that, right? So you're not really guessing. Like there is some reason why you said that. So we just say proposed explanation. So that's your hypothesis, right? Prediction is what do you think is going to happen, right? So if I go back to the pee example, let's say my hypothesis was Felix is the one that peed. My prediction would be something like, if Felix did pee on the carpet, then I don't know, I'm just making this up. Then it should be, then the pee should be yellow. I don't know. I'm just making this up, right? So that would be a prediction, right? So I'm just saying, okay, I know Felix did it. Why do I think that? Because if he did do it, then it should be yellow, right? Theory is different. And this one, we really need to look at the context of how theory is used. Because if you're like me and you like crime shows, right? Like crime procedurals and stuff like that, right? The investigator is always like, I have a theory. And then if you're watching with me, and my husband probably doesn't like this because I do it pretty much all the time. If you're watching it with me, I would say, you don't have a theory, you have a hypothesis, right? Because in the scientific realm, a theory is an explanation that is supported by multiple lines of evidence over time. So if we go back to the previous example I talked to you earlier, right? Like I said, for something to be accepted in the field of science, it needs to be done multiple times over a period of time, right? So something like the cell theory, which I mentioned in the previous video, we'll talk about it later, right? That theory has been tested, I mean, pretty much since we found out what cells were, right? We kept testing it, we kept running the same experiments, we were tweaking those experiments, seeing if something will change, right? But now it has become a theory, right? One of the things that I like about theories, and again, I've mentioned this in the previous video, one of the things I like about theories is it can change, right? If for some reason, one of these days, you guys sitting there decide to go into the field of biology and you decided that you want to study the cell theory and you find something that disputes the cell theory, right? That's great. It's just you have to be able to test it multiple times over a period of time, right, in order for that to be a part of the theory, right? So super cool. We always adapt, right? As scientists, we always adapt to new information. There's a few things in the world of biology that is set in stone, right? If you've taken chemistry before, you might have heard of like law of thermodynamics or gas laws, right? Physics has a lot of laws, law of gravity, stuff like that. Those are set in stone because they are backed up by mathematical calculations. So like they don't change. Like gravity, is not going to change all of a sudden if we find something new. Like that's just how it is. Whereas for biology, if we do find something, we can build on that knowledge, right? So super interesting, super cool. Okay. Some of you guys, depending on what field you're on, you can actually be doing scientific inquiry, right? That doesn't maybe follow the traditional ways of like a scientific method, right? So sometimes there are these different ones right here, right? There's a hypothesis-driven experiment, which is the one that we just did, like the example with Felix, that would be a hypothesis-driven experiment. Observational descriptive studies, right? That could be if, let's say we discover a new species of shark, right? And you have to observe it over time, right? And learn about the shark. That is an observational descriptive studies. If let's say you're in paleontology, paleontology is also a branch of science, right? You're describing the dinosaur, you're describing the place where the dinosaur might have lived, that kind of stuff. And then there's development of models and theory. So some of you guys, you might be computer scientists, right? You might be able to build models for scientific groups or business groups, whatever, right? Those are all considered scientific inquiry. So if we take a look at this same picture, right? And again, pause it if you need to, but it says for each scientific question you wrote down, decide which type of scientific inquiry that would be and the best way to investigate it. So you're going to have to go back to your list of questions, right? To your list of questions and see which one of these would fall under that category. Right? You can pause the video whenever you're ready, just play it again, and then I'll show you a couple of examples. Okay, so I just took a couple, and again, this is just practice, but you still need to be able to do it, so make sure that you go back and try it yourself, right? So here's an example. So observational descriptive studies, that would be determining the prevalence of coat colors. So if you wanted to know how often does a black cat show up if these two types of cat parents mate? That would be an observational descriptive studies because you are describing what is going on, right? Hypothesis-driven experiments would be the testing of different types of food to evaluate effects of growth. I mentioned that earlier, right? If I do like different types of food brands or amount of food, however, right? And then the last one is development of models or theory. You can create a model to predict the coat colors likely for kittens of pair. Oh my gosh, sorry, words. Create a model to predict the coat characteristics likely for kittens of a pair of adult cats. So if I have, let's say, a black cat and an orange cat, right? I can create a model that would say if I have a black cat and an orange cat, then I might get, I don't know, two black cats, one orange cat, and one multicolored one, right? So that would be something where you develop a model. Okay. And again, this is one of those things, like I said, poor inferences. We mentioned it a little bit earlier in the video, right? We need to make sure that we are okay and we are good on our inferences because this is again how miscommunication or misinformation happens, right? So here are a few consequences of that. So in case you're not aware, in the scientific field, before we publish a paper, we have to go through a rigorous cycle of having other people read it and correct it or whatever, right? Judge it or approve it, whatever, right? Because of that, it makes sure that I didn't miss anything. Because in our brain, right, our brains are marvelous things, but sometimes our brains are like, oh yeah, that's good. Like, I don't need to look over that. I have everything I need, right? You might have written an essay that was like that, right? You're like, oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. I have everything I need. Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. I don't have any grammatical or spelling errors, right? Because our brain thinks that we already know what it is. But if you have somebody else read it, then they can pinpoint a lot better if you're actually missing something, right? I've done that multiple times. So when it comes to scientific research, especially when it deals with things like medicine, right? Or like a disease, right? You guys need to be extra careful with that because you don't want to just be like, oh, yeah, 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 I think this drug that I made is good. Like, you don't know that, right? So somebody else needs to check with that. And on the bottom there, it says even criminal prosecution could be a issue, right? And believe it or not, it does happen. Okay, let me put all of this out so I can explain what this is. Okay. A lot of you guys probably spend a lot of time on the internet, right? One of the things that I want you guys to be able to do, like I said, is to be able to look at something on the internet and say, hey, that's not true, right? Now, some of you guys, I'm gonna direct it towards the ladies first, but I'm sure men, you probably also have this. I'm very big on makeup, right? I like being able to try them on, try and see how it looks, how it feels, stuff like that, right? Influencers out there, sometimes they get paid to say good things, even though they don't really feel like it. So this is the same thing with misleading graphs. So if you take a look at it, right? It says household pet ownership. If you notice, the uh the x-axis of this part is the same, but these are different, right? So the one on the left it makes the graphs look taller. The one on the right make them look shorter, right? So depending on what message you're trying to send, you might favor one over the other, right? Because it strengthens your case, right? So maybe let's say, I don't know, maybe let's say you own a pet shelter and you want people to adopt more pets, right? So maybe, oh my gosh, here we go again. Hold on. So maybe you'll want to use this graph because you're like, oh my gosh, look how low these bars are, right? We need more pets to be housed in, you know, in families and in places. So blah, 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 whatever, right? Or the other way, if you are, I don't really know a reason why you would want to diminish the amount of household pets, but maybe you hate animals. I don't know why you would do that, but let's say you hate animals and you might be like, oh my gosh, like, look how rampant these pets are. Like, they're just all over the place and they're blah, 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 blah. I can't even think of a reason why you would do that, but that's just an example, right? So, a lot of times on the internet, and I'm sure you guys have maybe experienced this, right? They give you the information and twist it in a way to make you feel or think a certain way, right? And this is, again, a skill I would like you guys to learn so that you can't just be like, oh, yeah, like just take in that idea instead of questioning it, right? So people do that. They do it on the TV as well, right? I'm gonna go back to COVID again. In the midst of COVID, whenever they're reporting deaths, right? Because they would say something like, I'm just gonna make up a random number because I can't think of it off the top of my head. But they might say something like, "Oh yeah, there was like 1,000 deaths in California and 1,000 deaths in Idaho," right? But if you think about it, California is a lot bigger than Idaho, right? Saying that 1,000 people died in California, there's like millions of us in California. 1,000 is not a big deal, right? But in Idaho, if you say that 1,000 people died in Idaho, Idaho is a smaller state than California. That might be a more significant number to be worried about in Idaho, right? So again, perspective, right? Where is this information coming from and where is this being geared toward? What do they want you to feel about this information? So then that leads us to something called pseudoscience, right? Pseudo meaning fake or false, right? So pseudoscience, again, it's like using these big scientific sounding scary words to make you feel a certain way, right? So like it says here, it says often includes scary chemical or scientific names, right? Because for the regular person, if you say, oh yeah, this beverage here contains monoxide. Dihydrogen monoxide is water, H2O, right? But dihydrogen monoxide, that sounds very scary, right? So they could use that to, again, make you feel a certain way, make you feel scared about something, or deter you, or maybe have you come and, I don't know, like do this thing or buy this thing, right? Evidence is lacking, it poorly supports inferences, or it's misleading, right? And again, this is the difficulty, is sometimes it's just really hard to tell, right? And I'm gonna kind of get on my soapbox again here, but this is why they want you to take Bio 101. Some of you guys are sitting there and you're just like, oh my gosh, I gotta take biology. Oh, this sucks, right? But the reason why they give you all of these GEs, including biology, is they want you to be aware, right? They don't want you to be like, oh yeah, like there's this thing, meh, 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 whatever. And somebody who maybe did not take biology might be like, oh my gosh, like now I need to panic and blah, 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 blah. But you who have taken biology, you're like, my professor talked about that. That's nothing to worry about, right? That disease doesn't travel that way, right? So then you can be an advocate for just, I mean, really good information, right? So I'm just just kind of advertising biology a little bit, but that is the purpose of that. I have this link for you down here, right? It's just a fun little video that I show every semester, but I did link it on Canvas for you if you'd like to see it. It's just a little rap about pseudoscience. I'm not the one rapping, so don't worry. It'll be kind of silly, but it has good information on it. So I would suggest you take a look at that. It'll be on Canvas for you, right? So if you are taking Bio 101 Lab, you will probably be more exposed to the scientific method and how to use it over there, right? For us, we're just kind of learning about it as a concept. So not a lot of experiments for us here in this class, but if you ever take a lab or if you've taken the lab, right, you guys will experience that more there. But that's the end of our second lecture slides, right? By next week, we should be back in person. So then you can see all the crazy things that I do when I lecture, because right now all I'm doing is sitting and lecturing to my cat. So I'll see you guys in the next lecture.